Hello and welcome to the EMDR Maven podcast. I'm Julie Miller and I'm an EMDRIA approved basic and advanced EMDR trainer, an EMDR Institute regional trainer, and an EMDRIA approved consultant and certified EMDR therapist. I provide training through the EMDR Development Center, and you can learn more about that at the website emdrdevelopment.com. You can also check out all episodes of the podcast at emdrmaven.podbean.com. In each podcast, we'll have a question of the week to be discussed, and these can come from new and experienced EMDR therapists like you. We'll talk about a research study of particular interest in EMDR therapy, and we can talk about books, equipment, and ways to be creative to get EMDR therapy to work for your clients. I have advanced training information available through the EMDR Development Center website, emdrdevelopment.com. So send me your questions, your ideas, any resources you'd like to share with others, and any kind of request related to EMDR therapy so we can make this an interesting, fun, and educational time together. Let's get started. We have a special treat with this episode, and that we have a guest. Beth Brown is a licensed independent clinical social worker with nearly 2 decades of experience supporting new and pregnant moms. Since 2005, Beth has worked in various roles, including birth doula, lactation counselor, prenatal yoga teacher, and psychotherapist. She co-founded and coordinates the Pentucket Perinatal Mental Health Coalition, where she spent the last decade enhancing maternal emotional wellness through education, professional collaboration, and support. Beth is certified in perinatal mental health by Postpartum Support International. She's certified in EMDR by the EMDR International Association, and in psychedelic-assisted therapy by the Integrative Psychiatry Institute. She has completed all 3 levels of training in deep brain reorienting. She has published an article through the Postpartum Support International about using EMDR in the perinatal period and provides EMDR consultation in group and individual formats. Beth holds multiple yoga certifications, including 200-hour and 300-hour teacher certifications from Yoga Life and an 85-hour prenatal yoga certification from Pranakriya Yoga at Kripalu. Beth is licensed in both New Hampshire and Massachusetts and is a married mother of 2 grown sons, a spunky golden retriever named Maggie, and a lovely cat named Zac Efron. So Beth lives with Zac Efron. Her passion lies in supporting women in their most vulnerable and empowering them to feel strong and competent as mothers. She's curious by nature. She hasn't met a training she didn't like. She's fascinated by neuroscience and the body's capacity to heal, and she loves to laugh. So let's all welcome Beth Brown. Welcome, Beth. I'm very glad that you're here.
I'm really glad to be here.
Yeah, we had a question from someone who's a listener who was interested in if EMDR can be used with OCD. So you indicated that you have experience with OCD in treating that with EMDR, and I thought this would be a great thing for you to share with us. How does that work? How can you use EMDR with OCD? So tell us about that.
Yeah, I get this question a lot from my consultees. I see it a lot in the Facebook EMDR groups. And the answer is not that clear cut. I think that a lot of people really would love a very black and white answer, which is often us mirroring our clients' black and white thinking.
Right.
And I find that, the answer is that it depends. It's really important to consider the entire case conceptualization. To think about the whole picture.
What would you start with? If you had a client who came in who clearly had OCD, tell us how you would start. What would you do? Practical steps.
Yeah, practical steps is, if you start with that first phase of EMDR, and that's the way I work, right? I EMDR is sort of how I approach with that AIP model. That's the way I look at it. And I think that it might be important to just take a moment to consider, like, how do we see OCD through that AIP lens?
Mm,
And Sandra Paulson, who's one of my favorite trainers, describes OCD as a child's magical coping solution, which I think
mm,
is really interesting.
it is.
Um, yeah, I see it as a predisposed or learned adaptation to stress.
Huh.
I tend to work very somatically and from the bottom of the brain up versus the top down. So I see it as an adaptation, this adaptation as a direct attempt to avoid bodily sensations and cope with underlying distress. So, how you're looking at it is important. The research really shows that OCD it does stem from a combination of epigenetic and genetic predisposition, that 50% of the risk for developing OCD is genetic, right? Having a first degree relative significantly raises the risk of having the disorder. But there's a lot of overlap with trauma.
That
And
makes sense.
yeah, of course it does, right? Having a lot of co-occurring other issues is really very often. It's like I think 90% of the time. And there was one study, 2008, said that 82% of participants with OCD reported a trauma history. It's really significant how often trauma is co-occurring with OCD. If I'm seeing this as an adaptation to stress, it's almost like the predisposition was there, you add the stress, and then this is the normal adaptation or coping mechanism that shows up. A lot of times my clients will come in and they will have a first degree relative who exhibits the same type of thinking and behavior, the same looping in the brain. So it's important to recognize that, CBT, ERP, exposure and response prevention, ICBT, inference-based cognitive behavioral therapy, is
Huh.
another intervention in that world. They really see that the OCD is this looping in the brain. They're just looking at that piece. And it is, that's what the neuroscience says, that there's a lot of looping in that upper region of the brain. And if I kind of can take a second to talk about that,
Sure.
the neuro imaging research is so interesting to me. I'm so curious about all that neuroscience.
Yes.
But to oversimplify, there's abnormal cycling in clients with OCD, and they get stuck in this loop where the brain responds to too much error and almost like, did I lock the door? But I'm not really sure and there's a lot of possibility management happening. There's just too little to stop those signals of, I have to do something about it in their brain. So they get stuck in this cycle. And a lot of the most evidence-based interventions really focus on that looping and not the underlying trauma. And I do think that really taking an integrated approach to treating OCD is important because you do need to address that looping and we know,
Right.
right,
Right.
when we're working with EMDR, that there is exposure, right? We do expose people in the desensitization piece.
Right.
And I think that's why sometimes it works. But I really believe that what it requires is a much more integrated approach with many different modalities. SSRIs, for example, often help, not always, but often. Combination of an SSRI and a CBT, the research shows that that's much more effective. If there's trauma history, you throw some EMDR in there, and that's going to help even more. It's a very difficult issue to address and to treat.
So, how do you use EMDR other than the traumas that you identify at some point? Is there any other way that you use EMDR with OCD?
I do. I just want to reiterate in that history taking phase is you're really looking for co-occurring other disorders. You want to understand what their attachment background is, what their motivation for change is, how much insight they have into the disorder. A lot of times there's not that much insight. There's also a lot of emotional avoidance and does their window of tolerance look like? What other maladaptive coping mechanisms are they using? I have found usually clients that I'm treating with OCD are pretty defensive. There's a lot of defensiveness,
Mm.
denial being one of them, rationalization. And so that whole picture needs to be taken into account. And there often is, as you move out of, creating that treatment plan with the client into this preparation phase, that preparation phase is lengthy. And we know, right, working with complex trauma, that sometimes preparation is years, and sometimes that is the work for people. One of the things I start off with first is that I'm trained in ICBT, so in that inference-based cognitive behavioral therapy, and I included the link that you can share with people for that. The training's
Mhm.
free, it's all online.
Nice.
Um, the modules are all there. It's 12 modules. And then what that looks like is that after what I believe is sort of the sensation shows up in somebody's body, low in their brain. And then what happens is their defense kicks in, that coping mechanism, and a doubt shows up. What if I didn't lock the door? What if my husband's mad at me? What if maybe this, maybe that? So a lot of possibility. And we don't really argue about the possibility because anything's possible. It's about using your five senses to really know, is this happening right now? Do I see it? Do I watch myself locking the door? There's, much more to it than that. I'm definitely giving it a disservice, but I find it to be really helpful to give my clients a worksheet, explain the first module, have them do that over the week or the 2 weeks that I don't see them, talk about it in the next session, but sort of have that going on adjunctively. Because a lot of folks are coming in, they're so cognitively focused that it's a good place to start, right? Is to really
Right.
explain, do some psychoeducation about OCD, like what is happening in your brain and what's happening in your body. I also think that taking that initial time to really be in attunement with your client, it's critical. There's often an, insecure attachment with folks who have OCD. So
Oh,
making sure that you maintain that attunement and really avoid recreating past relational dynamics and trauma is important. So I try to go into every session with an open mind and not a plan. I may have a loose plan in my head, but just really keeping that concept, like what's actually happening for them. But to be in the moment with them and attune with whatever they're showing up with, because it's often a lot of anxiety, and just slowing it down and being with them is critical. I have not yet had someone come in with OCD that did not also have dissociation and internal conflict and ambivalence. Just seems to, I could be wrong. I'm sure there's people out there, but for me, I have yet to see somebody who doesn't have any internal splitting. So arts work is key. I use a lot of Dolores Mascara's progressive approach to dissociation. I find
yes.
that really helpful. Robin Shapiro's work is also helpful. And I use a lot of Robin's two-handed interweave
Yes. Uh-huh.
that because and it's such a sly way of sort of addressing what's happening without them really noticing it. I notice the direct approach sometimes can be just trigger all those defenses to pop up. If a client comes in with something just really simple, I don't know whether to go to the movies or stay home. And I say, well, what if you put one in one hand and one in the other? And then, we have some BLS, and there can also often be some resolution between those, or even parts that can work for parts.
Right.
Um, so that I find to be really helpful and usually one of the first EMDR techniques with BLS that I'll use
Mm.
with someone with OCD.
Because it kind of goes sideways, it goes around the side. It doesn't a direct confrontation. And so it's sort of like their brain can sort it out. You don't have to try to convince them of something.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. It's I often use those same words, just come at it from the side. The
Hmm.
direct approach just doesn't seem to, there's just too much defensiveness that will pop up.
Right.
Mhm.
So
It's
those are
funny.
good preparation ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, I often will liken OCD to sort of a diamond that you turn constantly to the different facets, because you might do a little work here, then you turn it, and you do a little work there, and you turn it. And it's just trying to loosen it all up. I get a
Yeah.
lot of people in my office who say that exposure response prevention is too much for them. They just
Mm.
don't, there's no motivation to really deal with that. They don't want that intensity. So we have to build tolerance for that and educate
Yes.
them about what is actually happening in their nervous system. I use a lot of Stephen Porges's analogies related to polyvagal theory. That
Right.
can be helpful. Frank Corrigan's information related to deep brain reorienting. If you've not taken that training, super helpful. And so, helping them understand what's really happening in the nervous system can be so helpful. That's one of their ways of coping is knowing.
So is there any way that you would use targeting a a ritual, or would you use EMDR to specifically target a repetitive thought or rumination? Is that something that you do with EMDR and OCD?
Some clinicians do that. I don't find that to be helpful, or I
Ah,
haven't found that to be helpful. I tend to target what happens when you don't check the door, or you don't seek reassurance. That will happen in session. That's one of the things you really have to know when you're treating with OCD is that you can't reinforce the compulsion. So they will come to the therapist with, am I okay? Am I good enough? And of course, we want to reassure. This is part of our work. But when you're talking about OCD, it feeds the cycle. And
ah.
so I might say something like, what does it feel like in your body when I don't reassure you? I wonder if we might slow down and just see if you drop into your body, what does that feel like? Typically, the sensation that comes up when they don't complete the compulsion, I often say, where do you feel that? Say it's in their chest. What's your negative belief about yourself when you feel that? And then I float back and find where it's coming from. So I tend to go at it that way. Sometimes I have them track the sensations. Sometimes I float back and treat it with EMDR if they're ready for that. But that, I find that some clinicians target the worst fear, like that's what the flash forward is. Some do the worst, the first memory from before, or the compulsion itself. And I find that if you get underneath and find the sensation and the emotion, if they don't complete the compulsion, then you're really targeting where it's coming from. It's listed in the bibliography I put
Yeah.
on the document.
Thank you for doing that. I think that's, a lot of resources for people. It's great.
Yeah, that's what I always want. I always want a list. Often the question is, what's the protocol? And I
Right.
don't really think that's the question. I think the question is, how can I use EMDR specifically? Give me some examples. And this is
Right.
why consultation is so important. And I
Hmm.
often, maybe posting on a Facebook page is great for some ideas for training and stuff. But if you have a real case that's complicated, there's nothing better than consultation because this is where you're going to get some very specific examples for your specific situation, which is so different from every other
Right.
situation.
And it sounds like with this complicated issue of OCD, there's usually other things going on as well. There's trauma there. There's dissociation there. It's a complex presentation. And so just using EMDR alone is certainly not an appropriate treatment. It's a part of an integrated treatment for someone with OCD and the other issues they may have going on.
A lot of people will use detour to deal with the compulsions to reduce that urge to complete the compulsion, and that is helpful. If I've got somebody and it's a 10 out of 10, I have to pick. Even sometimes there's an overlap with picking and whatnot. Using detour can really be helpful. That urge reduction protocol. This is, like I said, it's turning the diamond over and over again and just loosening up what's there. It's like a big knot, and it's slow work sometimes.
I like the idea of using the detour protocol with compulsions. I like that. I think that could be very effective in certain circumstances.
Exactly.
It tends to uncover adversity. So if someone is processing a particular, how intense does this compulsion feel? And at some point, it's going to open up whatever it is that's underneath that compulsion, some adversity, some trauma, something like that. And that opens things up to get processed. So that I can see how that could be really helpful.
Yeah, I agree. It's to treat OCD in general, you have to have a lot of tools in your tool belt.
Mm.
It's
Yeah.
complicated, and there's a lot of things to sort of, you want to be able to pull that out at certain times, and even the level of urge to avoid, Jim Knight's level of urge to avoid can be helpful. So I will pull these different things out in different situations, and they're really helpful. And I love to feel, because it does. They often expose the underlying issue, as I see it through my lens, is there's just so much avoidance. And this adaptation is these loops help them to avoid what they're feeling and avoid that
Yeah.
trauma.
And I think you're making a really important point, which is that when we're using EMDR, maybe right after you get trained, and then we're using EMDR, we don't know that there's all of these resources, ideas, techniques, things that you can do in certain circumstances. So I always recommend that folks get as much training as they can get. And even in areas that they don't think they're really that interested in, because it might be an addiction training that would get you the detour protocol or the level of urge to avoid, but you can use that in with other issues as well. So get those trainings so that you've got all those tools and you can just pull them off the shelf when you need them. I think that's a really important thing to recommend to folks.
I think you're right. And
Get as
I
much
think
training as you can.
get as much training as you can. My consultees will say, where should I go first? I say dissociation first.
Yes, that's good. That's a good one. Yes.
And there are many ways to deal with that, but here are a couple. And then, you kind of go with your interest from there. But I think you're right. I might have even been a little compulsive with my own training, honestly, right? After I was like, wow, I think this is not enough for sure. And I took like a million trainings
Yeah.
those first couple years after getting my basic training. And honestly, it helped tremendously.
Yeah, I think it's served you well because you can pull from the different options that you know, and it's important to have all those tools.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Well, thank you again for your time.
You're
And
welcome.
new stuff is always coming up on the EMDR Maven podcast. And thank you very much for
It's
doing this podcast.
absolutely. I'm so grateful that you're doing it. I mean, it's so fun.
So many thanks again to Beth Brown from the New Hampshire, Massachusetts area, and for spending time with us and providing resources. Now, the resource document that she mentioned will be on the website of the EMDR Development Center. So that's emdrdevelopment.com under the page that's called Free Resources. So I hope that you will all check that out. I want to remind you that there's advanced training and free classes at the emdrdevelopment.com website. There's addiction-focused protocols, stabilize addiction, and titrate trauma processing. The use of multiple addiction protocols and specialized resources for addiction clients. You'll get 4 CEs for it if you complete the training. And I'm always available to answer any other questions that you all might have. I can answer those for you, and we can also discuss it on the podcast. So please take a look at that. There's free resources about other parts of standard protocol, and there's also a free class on the safe state or safe place exercise and what to do if it doesn't work. If you have questions you want to send me so that I can answer them or we can discuss them on the podcast, please feel free to send me an email at jmiller4721 at gmail.com. And until we talk again, take care.